This was one of there were several sort of working groups that were formed during the 2017 fellowship. Um, and this group was sort of like self-formed because we all kind of wanted to understand what we were doing. And then of course, Lou joined us because she's really sort of piloting a lot of what all of this means. And so Malin and I are going to present today, and Jennifer and Andy, of course, are still going to be actively contributing to the conversation as this kind of goes through. So why C3? Well, we wanted to call ourselves something clever, and we were really interested in how do we make culture change happen. So catalyzing culture change is where we were going. And what we were trying to understand, both of ourselves and of our cohort, and then the broader community of how we sort of fit in to our organizations and the communities, and like what role did we play and what influence could we have in making that culture a culture that supported the science and supported our people that are doing the science. And so looking through kind of how we play this role, like what do we actually do during our day-to-day activities? How do we actually fit inside the organization? All of these questions that Lou and Kitty already set up for today's conversation are sort of things that we were trying to understand. And so what are the ways that we can actually work within that system to make knowledge accessible, to make it visible, and to add that sort of like formal layer to how things are interacting? And then where do we actually sit in terms of what skills do we have? What skills have we learned along the way? What do we actually do with our time? Where do we sit in the organizational structure? So those are all sorts of questions that we've been asking ourselves for many years at this point. So the two primary research questions are what skills do community managers use? Is there some sort of skill set specific to that? And I think everyone's familiar with the concept of the CSCCE skills wheel at this point. That was a product that came out of our working group. And then the other one was where do community managers sit within their organizations? How deeply buried in the org charts are they? And how many relationships do they have to maintain, either formally or informally, to do their job effectively? And Malin will talk a little bit about that. Okay, so time tracking using the skills wheel. Again, a quick refresher for anyone on the call that isn't familiar with the skills wheel. We took some inspiration from several skills wheels that are in various professional organizations, especially the Community Roundtable had a nice skills wheel. But we went through and basically took a bunch of job descriptions and wanted to think about what were the components that people were actually using. And then we came up with this sort of language to describe that. And so it's split into these 5 components: the technical, interpersonal, program management, program development, and communication. Okay, so time tracking. During our year-long fellowship with Lou, we asked the members of our cohort, not just the C3 team, but everyone, to track 10 days of their job. And so using the skill wheel terms, so each 5 category is separated out into specific terms. We had people sort of catalog for 10 days in 1.5 hour blocks, because that seemed about right in terms of figuring out how we break up our day. And we didn't want to have to ask people to catalog every 20 minutes. So it seemed to be a good enough resolution. So do that for 10 days, so 2 weeks. Then we took each skill used and we summed them and normalized them to 100. Some categories had, only a couple of skills used during that 2 weeks, and some people used a lot of them. And so out of 100, we sort of normalized them, and then we put them into a couple of graphs that I'll show you in a little bit, and tried to look at how could we explain what the relationship was between the skills that people used and the communities that they served. So here's the time tracking skills wheel. This is the cohort by last name, and the breakdown into the 5 main categories: interpersonal, program management, program development, communication, and technical. And you can see that everybody sort of uses all of them, but there's definitely some differences in the wedges of the pie. And so looking at some of these, you can sort of see there's, very narrow. So Andy, for example, at the time wasn't using a whole lot of technical skills, potentially, and Marcia Lucas wasn't using a lot of program development skills at the time. And so this is just a snapshot, right? This is 2 weeks, and we recognize that everyone's job changes and matures as the community changes and matures. So this is a snapshot at the time, but it doesn't necessarily reflect kind of what they're doing now. But there were some differences, and so we wanted to see if we could kind of tease out with some fancy stats, what that might look like. So here is the time tracking separated out in the PCA plot based on the type of community. And these are the types of communities that mapped best to our cohort. This isn't necessarily inclusive of all types of communities. This is just reflective of the people that were part of that fellowship. So there was collaborations, there were societies, and then there was sort of this concept of infrastructure. And you can sort of see there's like a big cluster. I don't know if you can see my thing. There's like a big cluster of people that are all kind of right here. But then there's a few ones that kind of break out in terms of who runs societies, who's working on science collaborations, and then kind of who's doing some infrastructure stuff. So it started to look like there was maybe some correlations between how people spend their time and the type of community that they're supporting. And again, this is all, you know, the N was quite small, but it was kind of an interesting conversation to have in terms of like, can we start to describe different types of communities by the community manager and the community manager roles? And then does that go back and reflect into the job descriptions and evaluations that people are having after that? So that gives you kind of a quick primer to that. And I'll hand it off to Malin to talk about the org charts.
Yes, next slide, please.
I'm just making sure I'm not looking in chat, so anybody should interrupt me if anything needs to happen.
Next slide, please. Yes,
okay.
Thank you. So we decided that since scientific community managers were very new at the time we did this work, we thought that there wouldn't be a clear way for them to fit in any sort of traditional organizational chart. And at least the scientific organizations tend to be very hierarchical and people do different things. And somebody who does a little bit of everything is sort of hard to fit into that structure. So we asked everybody in the cohort to draw up their organization charts, and both their formal chart and the sort of informal chart where you can see who they actually interacted with in the structure. And we confirmed that structures are, we can take next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, and we confirmed that most organizations that we studied were fairly traditional and hierarchical. And if community managers were placed somewhere, it was typically either as part of communications, or if there was a separate member services branch, they would fit in there. And they would fit fairly far down in the strategy, in the hierarchy, so maybe on the 3rd or 4th level. And almost nobody was involved directly with leadership or the really strategic positions. And what we concluded from this was that most community managers will have limited possibilities to work with strategy. I mean, to me, community manager is a very strategic role, but probably many people didn't see it as that then. And that many community managers would then lack influence, at least official influence, over the org's strategic and long-term planning. So our hypothesis was that the community managers will need to be really cross-cutting and work across silos and across different parts of the organization. And if we go to the next slide, here is next slide, please. Yes. Okay, that was. This is just tiny parts on the. This was, yeah, you can see the official chart here is my organizational chart as it looked like in 2017. We basically had one director at the head, then 2 parts, which was development and communications and science and training, and I sat on the communications branch. But what is sadly not visible in this chart is that we had 5 different pillars of activities. It was communications planning, it was funding planning, it was programs and projects, it was community planning and strategic planning. And all these were different groups. Oh yes, actually, you can click them and see them, yes. And basically I was part of every group. So my dotted lines were all over the place, and essentially. And my organization is actually flattened by now. So we cut off the director's position and just moved down. So now we're pretty flat, but I'm still in every group. So I'm not sure if everybody, yes, we can go to the next slide for this. And I would be personally interested to do this type of work with more organizational charts, because we have fairly few data points, and it would be interesting to see both if our original conclusions hold and if things have changed, because scientific community managers are more specific roles now. You can see people hiring specifically community managers, and maybe also organizational structures have shifted, but we don't know yet. Thank you. We can go to the concluding slide. And we want to thank all of the members of our original cohort for letting us use basically all their job descriptions and their time and their org charts. And thank you.